Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Carrie Burke, your moderator for today's webinar, Enumerating Enterprise Attack Surface. You may send in questions at any time during the presentation via the Q&A chat feature. We will collect these and address them at the end of today's presentation. I would now like to introduce Dan Cornell, a globally recognized application security expert who holds over 15 years of experience architecting, developing, and securing web-based software systems. As Chief Technology Officer and Principal at Denim Group, he leads the technology team to help Fortune 500 companies and government organizations integrate security throughout the development process.
Thanks, Carrie, and thanks everybody for joining in today. Today we're going to talk about something that I think to be extremely important for organizations looking to build security programs, and that is enumerating the attack surface for your enterprise. And really, that means understanding how you are potentially exposed. And as we'll discuss further, specifically in the area of the applications and software that you deploy. That's a picture of me. I'm the founder and CTO of Denim Group, and I'm a software developer by background. And I think the important thing on this slide is that I'm a software developer by background who has come into the world of security as opposed to someone with a background in network and network penetration testing that's now looking at web and mobile applications. And so that's just something about my background that colors my perspective. There's a slide talking a little bit about Denim Group, but what we really want to talk about today is attack surface. And so that's in thinking about your enterprise and thinking about your organization. What are all the different ways that you are potentially exposed to attack? Because as we'll see, understanding this or having you'll probably never have a complete understanding of this, but having a solid understanding of this is something that is very important when you look to craft a security program, because you obviously need to know about attack surface, but then you need to use knowledge of that attack surface to determine how you're going to deploy the limited resources and assets that you have in defending that attack surface. For the purposes of today's discussion, and I include this, some people love this cartoon because I think it speaks to the frustration a lot of people have in the security industry. Other people don't like this cartoon because they think it's user-shaming, but I wanted to include it here today just to make the point that a completely holistic view of attack surface is going to be beyond what we're talking about today. We're not talking about, if you think about total attack surface for your organization, your targets of users for phishing and their desktops, things of that nature, there's a lot of aspects of total attack surface that we just don't have time, and it's not the target of what we're talking about today. Really, today what we're talking about for the purposes of this presentation is talking about application attack surface. And so this is the software that you either develop or procure through some other means that you deploy in support of your organizations. Most specifically, or if you look at most organizations, that means the web applications that you've built and that you've deployed, web services, mobile applications, and so on. And so that's really going to be the limitation of the scope of what we're talking about today. This is an area where we've done and published some earlier thoughts. I have been talking for a long time looking at specific applications and understanding each individual application's attack surface. And so we've got slides and a link to a recording discussing that. My colleague John Dixon has also looked at the concept of reducing attack surface, and especially in budget-constrained environments where you feel that you're resource-constrained, what are the things that you can do to reduce your attack surface? So these slides, as well as these recordings, will be posted, and so feel free to take a look at these materials that we've also done in similar topic areas. So when we talk to organizations, so you want to roll out an application or a software security program, I think that's great for a variety of reasons. Obviously, I think it's a very important point of exposure for a lot of organizations. It's also how I make my living. So if no one was concerned about application security, I'd have to find something else to do, which would be really inconvenient for me. But when we talk to organizations, and thankfully this perspective has waned in recent years, but we still hear it from time to time. But it used to be a lot when we talk to organizations. We'd say, what are you doing to address the concerns you might have about application and software security? And they'd say, oh, we bought Scanner XYZ. We bought AppScan. We bought Fortify. We bought WebInspect. We bought Checkmarks. whatever that might be. And unfortunately, buying a tool, simply the act of buying a tool does not a software or application security program make. Because what a software security program is actually a combination of the people that you have on staff as well as that you may contract out to, especially the processes you have in place to watch the software that's being developed and to watch as it's being deployed, as well as the tools that you purchase in support of this, the technologies you support. And so really when we look at a software and application security program, it's this set of activities that you have in your organization that are intended to repeatedly produce appropriately secure software. One of the reasons that I really enjoy working in application security and software security is it's a very challenging area. And I think to get at the core of what is so challenging is that the people who understand the most about the risk tends to be the folks on the security team. They're the ones that are most familiar with the breaches. They're familiar with the classes of vulnerabilities. They see the risk exposure. And a lot of times they're doing the testing of applications to identify this exposure. The problem is that they can't actually fix the problems, right? They can't check the code out and go in and make the code changes that are required to address these issues. Instead, they have to go and convince development teams or DevOps teams to do this for them. And that, again, that makes it really challenging in a lot of organizations because you have one group that understands the risk, another group that is certainly not insensitive to the risk, but that has multiple and often competing goals because the development teams might care about security, but they have software features to develop. The development teams probably care about security, but they've got non-security related bugs to fix. And so when you look at security teams trying to influence development teams and the lines of business that employ them, there are a lot of challenges associated with this because there are these competing concerns. In addition, when you look in organizations, what you find are constraints. Resources. I've never worked with a security team that felt like they were overstaffed or that they didn't have enough to do. If you are working on such a team, please shoot me an email and let me know if you have open positions. I would love to apply. Every organization that we work with is resource constrained in often multiple ways. So you're looking at raw budget and cost issues, just how much money do you have available of budget that you can deploy. But there's also level of effort issues, questions for the team that you have in-house or contractors that you have allocated. What is the level of effort that is required to undertake these tasks? As I also mentioned, there's a lot of resistance in organizations because to really build a high-functioning application or software security program, you have to change the way that the organization is building software to incorporate new thinking, new tasks, often new tools. Apparently people hate to change. I've heard this, and I've actually experienced it as well in a number of organizations. So that's a real challenge. Again, you've got multiple stakeholders within an organization. They have competing goals, and you're, in a lot of cases, asking them to change what they're probably comfortable doing. Open source tools are out there, and they can certainly help from a raw budget standpoint. They're free as in beer, but these open source tools, as the quip goes, are often in a lot of cases free as in puppy. Because where they don't have licensing costs necessarily, they still do have costs to operationalize them. And so that may exacerbate concerns you have if your staff are already focused in other areas or are already spoken for. So this is really something where you need to view this rollout as a multi-stage process, right? It's not one magical effort, but it's something where you can use short-term successes and these gains to build further change. But really, when we look at a lot of organizations, especially ones that are just starting on this journey or that don't necessarily have a lot of maturity built into their organization in this way, the first challenge they need to overcome is the reality that you can't defend unknown attack surface, and that everything is important, then nothing is important. And so let's think about that a little bit, right? You can't defend unknown attack surface. If there are applications that you have deployed in your organization that you don't know about, they are presumably not going through any sort of secure SDL. You're probably not threat modeling them. You're probably not establishing security requirements. You're almost certainly not security testing them. And most certainly, you're not monitoring them from an operational standpoint, looking at the logs to monitor for attacks. And so if you have attack surface and applications that you don't know about, they're not under whatever aegis of protection that you have constructed it. So that's really, really scary. And as I talked about just before, every organization has resource constraints. And so every security team we've ever worked with has to make tough decisions. You can't do everything that you want to do. And so if you are unable to express your concerns or your preferences, if you're unable to say option A is more important than option B, that puts you in a situation where you can't make sensible resource allocation decisions, right? Because if everything is important, if everything is the most important thing, that's the same state of affairs as if everything is the least important thing, because you can't differentiate between them. And so for organizations, the mandate that comes out of this is you need to find out what is your application attack surface. What are the applications you have in your organization that are exposing you to risk? And in addition to that, you have to be able to communicate and express your priorities of the relative importance of these applications. And ultimately, you're going to have to treat them differently based on these priorities. And that comes back to a lot of these tough decisions that you'll need to make, where you're not going to be able to do everything that you want to do. So when we go into organizations and have these conversations about what is your attack surface, there's often this kernel of software that people currently know about, or that people are initially thinking of when they think of their software attack surface. What are these? These are the critical legacy systems that everybody knows about, because they're the core systems where a lot of value in the organization is driven through these. And you also probably have some notable web applications. Hey, we've got our website, we've got our customer portal. These are the things that are top of mind when you talk to organizations about what their potential exposure is from an application standpoint. And why do they know about it? Again, a lot of value probably flows through these applications, and that means that they have a pretty high profile. These are also the types of things where auditors or the governance folks come through, and they're the ones that you're getting asked questions about. In a lot of cases, you have formal service level agreements with customers that may address these things, where the customers have said, hey, from a supply chain standpoint, hey, you guys are providing us this application, you need to pay attention to the security of this, because the security of your application also impacts our security. And all too often what we find are the applications that people know about are the ones that the bad guys might have found and caused some sort of an incident. As these discussions continue, the idea and understanding of what the attack surface is extends. So then you start to, when you look at your organization, start to add in the rest of the web applications that you actually develop and maintain. And so what are these? Typically, these are line of business applications. Again, stuff that's driving value for the organization, where a line of business went through the process to procure or to build this application. When we work with media companies, there's a lot of event-specific applications. Hey, this is the property that was in support of this particular event, this particular movie, TV show, whatever that program might be. Why did these get missed in the initial review? A lot of cases, people forgot that it was there. Maybe the line of business procured it through some sort of a non-standard channel. Maybe it was picked up through a merger and an acquisition. So there's a couple of points to pay attention to here. When it comes to forgot it was there, some of the scariest meetings I've been in my entire career in the security industry have been around this topic, where you have people from the same organization sitting around a table having a discussion, and where they all learn things during those discussions. I can think of an organization, a financial services organization. They provided services actually to other financials, having a discussion where they said, oh, we've got application XYZ. And they said, well, what about application XYZ that we customize for giant bank A? Oh no, we deprovisioned that a while back. No, we didn't. We just deployed some updates to that, right? So this discussion going back and forth, where the organization, where the members of the organization realized that there was not perfect knowledge, even among folks that you would expect to be experts. And what was scarier here is this application was, in this case, written in Cold Fusion, and was essentially forklift taken, all the code was taken, copied onto a new server, and some changes were made to accommodate this particular bank. And so from an attack surface standpoint, all the vulnerabilities that existed in one existed in the other. From a remediation standpoint, anything that they had to do to the first one had to be done to the other. Oh, and by the way, they found a couple other copies of that application for other large banks. And so in a lot of cases, there is declining knowledge over time of exactly what the exposure profile looks like for applications, especially when the business has come in and forced people to do something that they might have been uncomfortable with from an IT standpoint, but almost certainly made sense from a business standpoint. We also see our cases where lines of business procure things through non-standard channels, and we'll talk about that more when we look at exposure because of cloud-based applications. We see a lot of cases where the IT department is perceived as the department of no, or maybe the security department is perceived as the department of no, and the internal dev teams in the IT department are perceived as the folks where when you say, hey, I need an application, they come back and say, well, we need to do this giant requirements document, and by the way, we can't get started on this for 2 years. Business folks aren't typically rewarded for following the rules, they're rewarded for getting things done. And so we've seen a lot of cases where if the internal development capacity wasn't there or was not performing as needed, lines of business went outside to alternate channels to procure applications to be developed. Made perfect sense from a business standpoint, certainly doesn't make the security team happy. There's also a lot of changes in attack surface that occur because of mergers and acquisitions. If you've gone through a merger, brought on other organizations, all of a sudden their attack surface is added to your attack surface. And if you don't have a great understanding of what your attack surface was before, you certainly don't have an improved understanding when somebody else, who probably doesn't know their attack surface, dumps their portfolio of applications into your bucket as well. And so these are challenges that we see across industries, across organizations of various, even organizations that are in other ways pretty sophisticated, these types of challenges come up. Then you need to start to think supply chain. What about software that you bought from somewhere? What are these? Again, more line of business applications that were procured for some specific purpose, support applications or infrastructure applications. How many of the technologies you've purchased have web-based consoles that are used to manage those technologies? Why did these get missed originally? Again, a lot of the scanning tools, especially the DAS or the dynamic testing tools, only work on web applications, and so fewer of the vendors in the security tooling space are asking you about your non-web applications, right? They're not asking about client-server apps that may be out there exposing you to a lot of risk because those vendors aren't going to make you money in getting those applications into your testing program. In a lot of cases, organizations just assume that the application vendor is handling security. That certainly may be the case. And as we'll talk about, when you look at prioritization and what your plans are for applications in different classes, that may be the assumption that you have to live with. But that is something that's a decision that we prefer to see made explicitly as opposed to one that is made by default. And then we see things with mobile. We see things with the cloud. And again, what are these applications? Supporting different lines of business, applications that are more for marketing and promotion focused, but they're still part of your attack surface. Why did you miss these? Well, now any jerk with a credit card and the ability to submit an expense report all of a sudden runs their own procurement office. We see this over and over again, and it's really scary. But again, if you look at it from the perspective of these different groups within the business, what they're doing makes perfect sense because they're going out and they're solving their particular business problem. Looked at from the security perspective, this is a nightmare because what it means is not only have any of these applications likely not been through any of the onboarding process that you would like to see, they're not included in any sort of your ongoing evaluation or management process, right? You don't even know they're there. And so what we see is for the security officer, their journey goes along two dimensions. And one of the dimensions is the perception of what classes of applications are part of their application and software attack surface. The other dimension is the depth of their insight into, for that class of applications, what their exposure is. And so what we see over time is, again, in a lot of cases, the initial perception is, hey, we've got web applications and they're exposing us to risk. Okay, why is that? Again, there are even more vendors. There are more vendors that provide tools that test for web applications, and so unsurprisingly, you probably hear about exposure because of web applications more. That's just the way that the market is going to work. Is you're going to be more aware of those. And also even organizations like OWASP that now have content and now have are having discussion about mobile applications, IoT, and things of that nature, were initially started to deal with this exposure because of web applications. Then you probably have client-server applications, again, often supporting lines of business. You may have desktop applications that people have procured. You've got cloud applications and services. You've got mobile applications. And so there are a lot of classes of applications that are potentially exposing you to risk. And it's important to understand the breadth of the categories in this portfolio. Again, what you do to address all of these will vary in the amount of effort that goes to them. And you may decide simply to accept risks in certain cases, and that's totally fine. As long as you have an understanding of what that attack surface and what your exposure is, then it is, I find it to be a lot more acceptable to accept risks that you know about rather than simply not to know about them. And so if we look at the journey that these security officers typically go on is, hey, we're worried about web applications and we know a little bit about our portfolio of web applications. All right, and then over time, hopefully we gain a better understanding of that. And then you get a progression. We know about web applications. We also know about client-server applications. And maybe we know a little bit more about our web application portfolio. And then we know a little bit more about desktop applications and the risks they expose us to, cloud applications and services, mobile. And then over time, hopefully you're getting a more comprehensive view of the types of applications that are potentially of concern, as well as a deeper insight across those categories. And the joke is, when you reach this point where you have a complete understanding of this, then that is called enlightenment. I assure you, you're not going to reach this point, but that doesn't mean that it's not something that you can strive for and aspire to. So the first decision that you need to make is what's going to be in scope and what's going to be out of scope. And that's something that I've alluded to a little bit. You're probably going to look at software from Microsoft and say, you know what, I'm going to trust the Microsoft security development lifecycle. I don't need to, when a new version of Microsoft Word comes out, I don't need to go fuzzing Microsoft Word, right? There are certain organizations at a high level of paranoia, large organizations that might be doing things like that. Most organizations, that's simply not a concern. What we see is basically everyone is going to say, hey, what's in scope for what I'm going to be concerned about is the software that we have developed in-house or where we have contract developers that are building that software. Why is that? That software is probably managing very sensitive data, and you have a greater degree of control over the security of that software because you can influence or command the developers that are working on things to do stuff, to fix security bugs versus developing new features if that's the decision that everyone comes to. In more sophisticated organizations, we see a lot more concern about the supply chain, or at least awareness of the supply chain, where they're looking at potentially more esoteric packaged line of business applications, and they're saying before we bring on these types of systems, we also need these vendors to go through some sort of a certification process because we have enough control or enough influence as a significant purchaser because there's regulatory concerns. We're going to consider this to be in scope, and we see that a lot in healthcare, looking at electronic medical records applications and things like that. The same with enterprise resource planning applications and things of that nature, where you see, hey, there's a lot of really sensitive data that is going into the system. This is a very significant purchase for our organization. We're going to apply a level of scrutiny to these applications in addition to the ones that we have internally. And as I mentioned, looking at packaged software, you have Google with Project Zero, where they're trying to make the whole internet safer, which is a very laudable goal. We see in certain financials more attention being paid, but again, for the majority of the organizations, when you look at the scope of their application and software security program, it's either only things that are being developed in-house or extends into more significant parts of the supply chain, and less to more generic desktop packages and things of that nature. So what does the process look like? The first thing you need to do is identify the application homes. Where does this stuff live in your organization and on your infrastructure? Once you have that, you can then start to enumerate the applications and collect metadata about them. And then repeat as needed. So when we talk about metadata about the applications, there's the kind of basic demographic stuff about applications. Is this written in Java or is it written in .NET? A little more significantly, is this a web application? Is this a web service? Is this a mobile application? That's going to potentially inform the type of testing that you do. And even more importantly, what type of data does this application manage? Does it have credit card information that makes it in scope for PCI? Does it have health information that exposes to risk because of HIPAA? Is this thing managing people's information from Europe, so it's a potential concern for GDPR, and so on and so forth. But also looking at the exposure of the application. Is this exposed to the public on the internet? Is this only exposed to partners via some sort of a constrained network connection? Is this only exposed in-house? And so by capturing that data, metadata, especially the security influencing metadata, that's going to help you to make those prioritization decisions that we talked about earlier. And again, we'll touch on that some more here in just a little bit. And this is something you're going to need to repeat as needed. This isn't something that that you do once and then you're done or you're finished. This is something that is an ongoing process. And why is that? Number one, you're going to, over time, gain greater insight into where these application homes are and where different things are hidden. But also, your business is not static. Your organization is not static. They are hopefully going to retire old products, maybe, but they are also going to be developing new products because they're going to find new groups they want to serve. They're going to innovate, build new products, which is fantastic. It's required if a business is going to be an ongoing concern. But that also means that this application portfolio is going to evolve over time, and in most organizations, the application portfolio expands over time. And similarly, if your organization goes through some sort of merger and acquisition activity where you are acquiring other businesses, acquiring assets from different businesses, that's going to cause your application portfolio to evolve. If you're lucky, maybe you get to divest yourself of some applications. For whatever reason, I don't tend to meet a lot of people that are lucky, and that's unfortunate. But this is something you're going to need to repeat as needed. So where are these applications? These may be in data centers that you control, that are in-house data centers. They may be in data centers that are third parties, that are contracted to third parties, or maybe dedicated servers or rack space, something like that. Also at cloud providers. Maybe you've got applications in some combination of AWS, Azure, the Google Cloud Platform, or maybe you're just using cloud-based applications like a Salesforce.com. And so, where are these applications? You need to determine where are the different places where we are hosting these applications. And those may be, you probably have a list of approved locations to host these approved locations where applications can be hosted. And I suspect that people in your organization have also found unapproved locations to host apps as well. So how do you enumerate applications once you've identified where they are? There are the technical means, and we'll demonstrate a couple of tools that we found to be very helpful, such as network inspection and looking at DNS and doing searches of other registries of information. And in what ways are often even more helpful, non-technical means, doing interviews, doing other research around your organization to identify things that you can't find via a purely technical means. So let's look at a couple of tools. If you look at IP range detection, saying, what are the different IP ranges that have been associated with our organization? There's a great tool from the folks at Hurricane Electric called IPOSIN. You can feed it a company name. It goes out and looks at different data sources. So it goes through whois, ripe, Aaron, hurricane zone databases, census for SSL certificates, security trails. And what it attempts to identify are, for a given company name, what are IP ranges that have been associated with this organization. And just to get an idea of what that looks like, we'll kick that off and let that go. And as you'll see, it looks through these various data sources, scraping information from different places. And this is going to compile a list of the IPs and the ranges that have been associated with this, organization name. And so we can look at, here we go. These are this is a list of IP addresses that at one point in time or another have been associated with Denim Group. So what does that give you? That gives you a list of IP addresses that are external facing that may be associated with assets that you have. You can start to look to determine, are these, for these IPs, are these still things that we actively are using? What potentially is hosted there? Nmap, super handy tool. Everybody loves Nmap, and you can easily craft command line args for Nmap where it's going to look for common web server ports. Obviously, ports 80 and 443 for HTTP and HTTPS, but also very important are to look for the less common HTTP ports, 8000, 8008, 8080, 8443, because these can identify potentially test servers or demo servers that are exposed as well. And a unfortunate reality that we have in the world that we live in is a lot of times demo servers are exposed with live and production data. I know that everybody who has is conscientious enough to attend today's webinar, clearly you would never do that in your organizations. Clearly. But for the people that aren't attending today, and in my experience in working with different organizations, from time to time it does happen. And so this is especially great for dense environments that you control. If you have data centers or portions of data centers that you control, you can run Nmap to identify where does it look like we're hosting potential web applications. So I don't want to go scanning the internet, so let's check my laptop. Great news, everybody. I'm not running any web servers on my laptop, so I'm clean. Your checks in your environment may vary. But once you see these IP addresses, you can look to identify what are the services, particularly web applications or web services that are hanging off these IPs that are associated with you. Next is DNS Inspection, or finding host names that are out there that are currently or in the past have been associated with the with given domain names. Two of the tools that we found that are handy for this are Subfinder and the OWASP tool Amass. Subfinder is looking through things like Ask.com, Archive, Baidu, Bing, Census, CertDB, so on and so forth. Amass is doing some basic enumeration and brute forcing if you ask it to, reverse DNS, and so on and so forth. And as well as scraping different web archives to look for things that look like host names that are associated with a given domain that you feed to it. And so, again, these are handy tools that are largely passive that give you the ability to get some insight into where, what host names may have in the past or are currently associated. So let's kick off those two guys. We see as these guys go through and identify stuff. Looking through here, some of these I can just recognize and see are currently active. Other things are ones that are no longer active, where it maybe pulled it out of a web archive or something like that. But again, this gives us a list of host names that have been associated with a domain name in the past. And so a handy way, again, to identify potential attack surface that allows you to then go and do further research. I won't demonstrate this tool just because it's not currently maintained, but a really cool tool that the Netflix folks had released a while back is one called Scumbler. And it would let you search various archives and then run applications through, or run different events through a vetting or a verification process. This is no longer maintained. They're looking for maintainers if someone is interested in this. But a subset of its capabilities that were really handy that we now just have to do, or that we now currently do just by hand, is it would search the iTunes Store and Google Play to identify applications that are associated with given keywords. And this is something that we found to be really handy. I remember a conversation that we had a number of years ago. It was about something unrelated, but at the end of that we said, hey, we're doing some training on mobile application security, or we've got a webinar coming up on mobile app security. We were talking to a hospitality company, and the security officer that we talked to had said, said in response, like, oh yeah, hey, we're thinking about doing some mobile application stuff, so I'm interested in mobile application security. That's great. Well, and the sales guy on the call, who is a clever sales guy, which is the best kind of sales guy, went out and did some searches and said, actually, your iOS application has been out there for a couple months, and it looks like your Android application went live last week or the week before. And what had happened, and this is a testament to the power of shadow IT, but what had happened is a department in this organization had gone out, wanted to build a mobile app, didn't like the answer they got from their IT group, so instead they went offshore to some developers who were more than happy to build a mobile app, or in this case, two mobile apps for them, and get those finished, developed, QA'd, and pushed out into the App Store. And so, in this case, this organization didn't know that they had mobile applications, and found out as a result of this accident. And so, again, love the Scumbler tool. No longer maintained, but you can do this basically just the same thing by searching different keywords. Another, and this really isn't within the bounds of what we're talking about today, but another really interesting phenomenon you want to look out for are applications that may be in the App Store associated with your keywords or with your brand, but ones that you didn't construct. And we've seen that a lot in the financial services space and other space where potentially malicious actors are deploying mobile applications into the App Store where those are confusing and potentially making good guys think that those applications are associated or are approved by your brand. So that's not really in scope of what we're talking about today, but another value in periodically running searches against the major app stores to identify, for the stuff that's out there, is there the potential for confusion or malicious applications, may be picked up by potential customers and associated with your brand. So now let's look at less technical ways of identifying applications. Interviews. I talked before about that incident with the financial services firm where just having a couple of their folks in the room talking about applications and what's deployed yielded some terrifying but also valuable results. So if you can go talk to line of business representatives to ask them, what are the applications that you have deployed in support of your line of business? Now, ultimately, you're going to need to translate how they define an application into what you define for the purposes of your security program. But if you think in terms of business processes and talking through the processes that they use to accomplish their goals and mapping that back to the application constructs that are needed in order to support these business processes, that can help you to start to take their knowledge of their infrastructure and the applications they use to accomplish their jobs every day to translate that back into the artifacts you need to fit into your application security program. You can also talk with tech leads, and they're in a lot of cases going to be more familiar with the deployed infrastructure and other assets. They'll know, like, hey, we've got some dedicated servers over here. We use this service. We've got a cloud VPC that also does some stuff, whatever that might be. And in a lot of cases, the tech leads, if you can get time from them, are going to have a more specific knowledge of the tech infrastructure that you are potentially concerned about at the end of the day. There's also other research, disaster recovery plans. If somebody cares enough to make sure that an application is up, they probably have a disaster recovery plan, or hopefully they do. And if somebody cares enough to make sure that it's up, you probably care enough to include it in your security program. And so disaster recovery plans can be, if you find ways to enumerate those in your organization, those can be a valuable source of knowledge about your application exposure. And accounting can be valuable as well, because you can find cloud providers via the billing records. And I know there's a number of vendors in this space. I think the Cloudability folks actually were just acquired last week, but they had a methodology where they would identify your cloud spend. Their purpose was less about security and more about optimizing from a finance standpoint, optimizing the spend that you had on cloud resources. But by querying accounting to look for various areas of spend on cloud providers, that can help you to identify where you may have exposure via cloud systems that you otherwise might not know about. Again, shadow IT. So what is an application? Right now what we've got is a list of IP addresses, a list of host names, hopefully we've got a list of mobile apps, we've got a business person's view of what applications they have. From that, you need to create a consolidated view, and you also need to correlate those applications in the supporting infrastructure, because that's required really to have a full understanding of the risk that you're exposed to associated with these applications. We talk about collecting metadata. This ranges from technical metadata, what is the language, what is the scale of the application, also architectural questions, is this a web app, is it a mobile app, what is the level of exposure, and from a data standpoint, typically, what are the regulatory impacts of having this application and the data that it manages responsible for, having your organization be responsible for those things. And finally, we need to agree that value and risk are not equally distributed. Some applications matter more than others. That's just it's a fact of life, and you're not going to be able to treat them the same. And so when we look at which applications matter more than others, it's a question of what is the value of the data being managed? What is the character of the data being managed? That's going to, again, map to those regulatory concerns, but also to your business concerns. What is the value of the transactions being processed? Who cares if this application goes down, and how much is it going to cost them per hour that it's down there? In addition, from this, you can't treat these applications all the same. You're going to allocate different levels of resources to assurance, and you're potentially going to do different types of testing or different types of assurance based on different types of applications. So when you're selecting different assurance activities, saying, hey, we need to do an annual pen test of this, or we want to do a quarterly code review, or this is an application we want to prioritize for getting some application security into the CI/CD pipeline, that should be driven by the character of these applications. And those all, again, are going to have to fit into the compliance and the regulatory requirements. There's going to be things that you're simply required to do because of compliance and regulations. Once you've got that figured out what you have to do, then you can start making discretionary decisions about how to, how to allocate your remaining resources, of which hopefully there are some. So again, don't treat all applications the same. And this is something that's where you're going to need to rinse and repeat. This list is going to change over time, and metadata is going to change over time. And we found this especially to be true in a world of microservices. Where organizations that are undergoing so-called digital transformations, where they're adopting more deployments into the cloud, where they are adopting architectures like microservices, with the point being, in a lot of cases, we need to make these more flexible so that we can compose these and expose these to stakeholders in different ways. All of a sudden you find yourself in a situation where you have a much more fluid application portfolio than you might have had before. So, to get back to where we started here, you can't defend unknown attack surface. If you don't know about these applications, then you're almost certainly not providing any sort of meaningful security around them. And that's hopefully that would scare the type of people that would attend this webinar. And also, it's really critical to understand if everything is important, then nothing is important. You have to be able to communicate and express the values that you place, or the value you place on different types of applications, because in the absence of that, you're not going to be able to make the critical decisions you need to make on allocation of scarce resources. So, find out what applications you have in your organization. and collect metadata about them, and use that to determine the relative importance of these applications and treat them differently based on this. Now I'd like to open the floor up for questions. Okay, let's see here. All right, opening the question stuff. One question here is we've got, the question is, you talked about some open source tools in the space. Are there also commercial options? Yeah, there are. And this is an area where, interestingly, in the past probably year or so, I've seen an expansion in the commercial providers that are out there doing this. The Risk.io folks have been doing some of this for a while, a little bit of a different take, but have gathered some of this information. Most recently, and kind of more specifically, we see Bit Discovery with Jeremiah Grossman and Robert Hansen, Helios from Daniel Meisler. HT Moore has his Rumble stuff that's more, I think, targeted at internal asset discovery. But so there's some smart folks out there that are looking at this, commercial solutions to this problem, which makes sense. Now, as we talked about before. A great thing about open source tools in the application security space or the security space or just in general is they can help to address raw budget concerns, but they're free as in puppy in that there are costs associated with the operationalization of those tools. And so with the stuff that we've looked at here today, you can very easily start this process and start to kick up some data where you might have questions about saying, hey, what are these host names? What are these IP addresses? What are we hanging off of these? What are we hanging off of these servers? Let's do some, pull them up in a browser, do a quick check. From a home screen standpoint, what are these things exposing? And so this is something where you can certainly, where there are open source tools that are available to help you start along this way, and that's something, again, from a consulting standpoint, we'd be happy to do that as well, but it's also something where I think it merits, as you want to drive more maturity and as you get an understanding of this, where you potentially also want to consider, some of the commercial entrants in this space as well. Next question is, when you're making, what sort of decisions do you have to make based on the prioritization? So I talked a little bit about this. I talked a little bit about this before, where when you look at crafting an assessment program, or looking just at your application portfolio in general, what are you going to do for these different applications? And so you may look and say, well, hey, we've purchased XYZ static scanner, dynamic scanner, IAST. We've got WAF licenses, RAF, whatever it might be, right? So you've probably got some set of tools. You've got some set of in-house people or third parties that you're using. You want to prioritize using that capacity to the most into the most valuable areas. And that's going to speak to the level of inspection that gets applied to an application, as well as the frequency of that inspection. And so for some, again, maybe public-facing apps that aren't managing or sitting on top of a lot of valuable data, maybe you say to those, you know what, we'll do annual or hopefully more frequently. Maybe we'll do quarterly scans of those with our dynamic scanning tool, making sure that we've got a valid login. And that's the level of resources we can afford to devote to these applications. But when you look at the flagship applications that you have, you may say, you know what, these are the ones where we need to have a manual penetration test done for every major release, and where we're going to work with that dev team to get static analysis testing tuned and integrated into the CI/CD pipeline so they get a quicker notification of potential vulnerabilities. And so really it's looking at what are the assets that you have to bring to bear. And if you stratify the applications that you have, that can start to build out a plan to say, well, okay, we're going to identify apps as low, medium, high, and we've got X number of applications in each characteristic. What does it look like if we try to implement a plan where we do assurance activities A, B, and C against all the highs, and maybe change that for the medium and change that for the lows? What workload does that give you? Okay, well, is that something that you can work with, or do you not have enough resources to do that? And so it's kind of something where you figure out, well, how big is the problem, and what resources do I have to bring to bear, and how do I shift around my prioritization so I can apply that in some sort of so I can apply that in a way to craft a sensible plan. Another question here. Have you seen organizations that try to identify, enumerate, and correlate applications via their SIEM or other network security infrastructure? We have, with the kind of canonical example being, this is to solve a slightly different problem, but set the firewall to like block all mode and see who complains, and then turn on the ports or the services that people need, based on their complaints. And so, yeah, I think there are a lot of opportunities to use this operational data in order to start to understand this as well. And so, if you've got your SIEM, you see what logs are being collected. That's valuable, but again, those applications you would have to have sufficient knowledge of the application existing in order to pull in logs, or in order to you to be pulling in logs. I also think there are some really interesting things that can be done via via watching network traffic, net flow traffic, and things of that nature, to also get an understanding of what's in your environment and how the things in your environment are talking to other pieces of that. And similarly, I think there's some really interesting opportunities in looking at these, kind of cloud-native applications where you've got microservices that are talking to one another, watching how those things are communicating with one another in order to draw out some understanding of what exactly do I have deployed out there, what's it talking to, and is all this stuff important, right? Or do I need to have all this stuff? And if I have this stuff, what do I need to do for the testing? Excellent. Are there any other questions? I think we're right about at time here. Give it just a minute. All right. Excellent. Well, good. Well, I wanted to thank everybody for attending today. Really appreciate you all taking some time to talk with us about this. Really appreciate the questions from everyone. We will have a recording of this available shortly, as well as the slides being posted. So if you want to share that with colleagues, we'll be mailing that out to everyone. Feel free to share it with any colleagues who might be interested. And if you have any questions about this, if this is an area where you'd like to talk more, again, please feel free to reach out. I'm easy to find. I'm Dan at Denim Group. I'm at Daniel Cornell on Twitter. Happy to talk more in depth if you have, or if you have questions that you want to take offline or anything like that. So thanks again for everybody for taking the time today. Really appreciate everybody coming out. And again, we'll be sending out some follow-ups here before too much longer. Everybody have a great rest of your day.